This is Sense Space. I'm here with Cadell Last. It's our premiere recorded dialogue, which is very, very dope. We've been in some sort of astrological conjunction in the liminal web for the last few years. Really been appreciating his work, writing these amazing volumes and really like actively binding together the fabric of a philosophical community, which is so essential. And um, yeah, there turned out to be a lot of interesting threads between me and Cadell, some of which we're going to be uncovering today. And yeah, this is definitely going to be an emergent conversation. Um, some of what we touched on last time, Cadell, was around themes you've been exploring at the portal, particularly around libido. And we've also touched on these deep, confounding questions around Christianity, plant medicine, emergence of new cultures in that area. So, how are you doing?
I think yeah, before we were in the cloud, I was saying I feel empty and alive in large part thanks to your sort of beautiful ceremonial opening and just sort of yeah, like feeling ready to speak at the vital edge as you're saying. I was invited to the vital edge and that's what I'm going to try and speak to today and all those themes, libido, Christianity, plant medicine, perhaps mostly libido and Christianity are
Hmm.
very alive for me. I find myself paying attention to a lot of the emerging discourses around Christianity in particular seems to be coming up not only in the last few months, I would say the last year. It's kind of been where I feel like our culture is doing its deepest work at the moment. So I'm always trying to pay attention to that razor's edge and go into the uncomfortable places where either I feel out of my comfort zone or challenged in my presuppositions or, just paying attention to what I think is the place where the body of our culture is tense and, you know, might need philosophical cognition. So that's kind of how I that's how I orient to these spaces.
Couldn't have put it more poetically myself. I really like that. Where the body of the culture is tense and
Yeah.
also where our deepest work lies. Yeah, I think both of us have a very distinct sense of that kind of rising tide of the wrestling and contending and integrating of Christianity, and it's confounding to see like first in your own life and then to like start seeing like it's kind of popping up everywhere, it seems, at the same time, um in response to the times. And in short terms, the Christianity that we have been handed down in many senses feels deracinated, unrooted, um, pallid, definitely desexed, um, and along with that, a whole host of sexual pathologies and different things, lots of shame, especially associated with Catholic Christian culture. And what I've been trying to hold space for is a reimagining, a re envisioning, a reinventio of Christianity being both a restoration and revival of core essences and truths which from my standpoint, if they truly are true, live beyond the bounds of Scripture, uh, to such a degree that if you got rid of all the Bibles in the world today and all record of Christianity, whatever that true essence, that Christological essence is, would still be there. And part of that reinventio is also something new. It's a very new world we're facing. And there's a lot of indications that the myriad crises surrounding us have some relationship to disconnection from the feminine and issues surrounding connection with the erotic. And in an expansive sense, this is core to the climate crisis from my standpoint. It's core to issues of fragmentation that permeate all of our systems, which are ultimately creations and expressions of people and the relationality between them. So I'm really interested to start like pulling at some of these threads around what is the disconciliation, the lack of coherent wholeness in our culture's relation, our like post-Christian culture's relation to libido and sexuality and the erotic and connection with the feminine nature of divinity. I know I'm putting out a lot here, Cadell, so I'm just gonna let you freestyle on it. And yeah, like how
Pass the pass the mic, pass the mic, pass the mic.
how do we
Okay.
yeah, go from
Let's
there, go
go,
from
let's go.
there.
So what I'm feeling into deeply, trying to sort of, you know, what I'm trying to embody is that when you approach religious themes, when you approach discussions about religion, I would argue that it's really important to keep it as close to the personal narrative as possible. Not that we can't see the universal in the universal spirit sense, in the world spirit sense, but just as an entry point, as a gateway into the world spirit, I think you have to enter first at the level of the personal, and really drop into the personal. Otherwise, I feel, I'm just thinking back on like when I was in my early 20s listening to all of these debates between atheists and Christians. And when I'm thinking back on all those debates, I'm like, no one was dropping into the personal there. Like these were just people talking past each other. These were just people basically in a universal abstraction war where you never meet the other. Like the archetype, like of like a Richard Dawkins debating a pastor, or like a Sam Harris debating some Islamic scholar. There's no meeting there. There's no actual, you could argue that those are not even theological conversations at all. That no theological conversations were happening there, So that's so like that's the context in which I want to drop in sort of personally here with approaching the religious dimension. I grew up in a broken home. I grew up in a broken home. I grew up in a broken world. And I think that the starting point to discuss that sort of growing up in a broken home and growing up in a broken world is on the level of libido, first and foremost, on the level of the relation between the masculine and the feminine. And being a symptom of that. And in some sense, I think the only way I became the man I am is by trying to do the best I could at every stage of my life to graft some concept of myself onto a positive masculine figure or a positive masculine role model of some kind. My grandfather comes to mind. My first teachers come to mind. And at the same time, recognizing at a very early age in my intellectual development that the institutions that I was entering into, specifically in an undergraduate university context, were fundamentally falling apart and broken. I knew they weren't broken yet. They were still functioning. This was back when I was in my early 20s. But I remember having conversations with one of my undergraduate supervisors, something along the lines of, when I'm your age, these structures are not going to exist, or when I'm your, like these, or something like these structures aren't going to hold me. You know, there's something really broken here. And long story short, this became sort of a source of deep intellectual inquiry during my doctorate, sort of trying to think through the decline of a certain institutional structural world in terms of the culture war that's raging. It's kind of like a deconstruction of the patriarchy. It's kind of a deconstruction of, that's what it sort of became on the culture war level, a deconstruction of patriarchy. I was kind of thinking about it as a sort of the decline of like the industrial the industrial world, certainly, but also sort of the telecommunications world, and all of that matrix, and the emergence of the internet being sort of this disruptive force and disrupting all of the institutions and all of the structures. And a lot of what I dedicated my time towards in my doctorate was trying to think through what would be the next system. What would the next system look like? And at the same time, going through the doctorate, sort of really becoming a symptom of the fact that there was no sort of intellectual or paternal leadership in the doctoral school that could, let's say, help me through it emotionally and effectively. And part of the consequence of that was writing the book, or co-writing the book, I should say, Sex, Masculinity, and God, which is, which is basically a trialogue with two other men, two other very different men around. It's basically a theological trialogue. And the basis of that book is basically saying, if we're gonna think through religious issues, we should start with the libidinal, the sexual, and build up from there. Build up from the sexual to the notion of masculinity, and build up from masculinity to a sense of the sacred, or God, or the theological. And where I kind of, where I kind of found myself during those trialogues, this was back in like 2019 now, so 5 years ago, even longer, 2018, I think they started, was just with a deep insight and respect for the symbol of the cross. I'm not someone personally who has, I did find myself in churches. I did find myself going to churches to pray. I didn't find myself necessarily needing to, or wanting to, or gravitating towards a specific denomination, but I did respect the beauty of the church. I did see the distinction between Christianity and Eastern religions, or Eastern spiritualities. And I came to have sort of an emotional, affective relationship to what the cross represented as a kind of contradiction, in my point of view, from the deepest pain to the highest flight, or the highest being. And that there's some sort of contradiction between the deepest pain and the highest being. That wording could be not completely accurate, or that could be, that was just sort of, my way of making sense into it. But this was sort of a long-winded way of saying that I think that I was born at a time, and I suppose by extension, we were born at a time when there was something really rotten at the core of the ground of our being, and I saw that first in the family. Of course, I couldn't make sense of it in this way as a child, but there's something really rotten at the ground of the family. And then I saw that there's something really rotten at the core of the institutions. And then I kind of find myself, well, let's have some conversations about sex, masculinity, and God, and sort of finding a lot of wisdom, finding a lot of meaning and significance in the symbol of the cross and the contradiction of that pain. So that's kind of the view, that's kind of like the lens that I'm trying to bring when I'm watching a lot of these conversations about Christianity coming up in the culture, and just thinking through that myself, and wondering how to participate.
Hmm. I first and foremost really appreciate the like giving deep context to the conversation that you've brought like from the get-go. And as soon as you spoke to like, oh yes, it ultimately has to be rooted in the personal. Like I immediately feel like, oh, like I'm actually more here in the conversation. Like as soon as you say it, it's like, oh yeah, thanks, Cadell. Like I'm remembering something. And yeah, I'm really honored to hear more of your story and feel a deep resonance with the like the leveling of it that you've described, like the something's off in the foundation. And we are a generation that is born into that and slowly like figuring out like largely through kind of just bumping up against different things in the world in context of institutions and relationships and so on to like slowly begin to find a kind of mirroring or some capacity to see behind our own eyes and to see into the depth. And ultimately, what I hear from you is that what we're contending with is deeply ancestral as well in foundation. And um, whatever kind of conversation meaningfully responds to our the circumstance of our sex, God, and masculinity is one that is deeply ancestral and understands the layers and layers and layers and the types of men and the types of relationships between men and women that have made up our ancestral trees in recent generations. And this is really key. And I talk about it a lot, but it would be remiss to not include the dimension of war um, and the impact of war in that, and also the intensive stratification of society into class and role and various forms of fixed identity, which is also kind of coupled with that historical level of basically exposing um, several generations of all of the men in all of the cultures um, to the horrors of war in a context lacking almost completely um, in any vital traditions of healing. Um, so that's the context. Like things have been broken in a culture that does not have the capacity to the sufficient capacity to heal and respond to the depth of what has been quote unquote broken. I don't believe things have been truly broken at a spiritual level. I do not, but at a very plain level, um, yeah, pretty much everybody has been traumatized by the recent circumstances of European history and other histories as well, no doubt. And this is really relevant to me for this because that is an assault on the energetic body of man. It's like a severance of that connection to those vital centers of energy. At least that's how I experience it in part. And I think this also gives potential. I'd like to know what you think of this, but perhaps this is also like deeply entangled with the deconstruction of patriarchy as an attempted response to the rot or the imbalance at the foundation. Like that's clearly one of the biggest prevailing responses to something being off, and it has a certain interpretive lens of what it is that's off. And then I'm hearing there's this other kind of walk that you've been on of sensing into what's off and kind of working through the finding of resolution to that or growing into that space personally. um I'm curious if there's like a distinct differentiation between those, or kind of how you experience that landscape.
Yeah, it's tough. You know what's coming up for me is something that my partner always reminds me of, which is whenever I talk about how messed up the world is today, or whenever I talk about how crazy the world is today, she always reminds me, and I know this philosophically, but she always reminds me on sort of like an immediate personal level in like sort of our day-to-day conversations is, she always says, the world's always been messed up. The world's always been mad. And there is a truth to that. And so like we go back and forth on that, and which is kind of like trying to disentangle the history of trauma and the history of rot and the present day issues of trauma and the present day issues of rot, and how do we make sense of that? Like, so like, like when I'm telling my story about something broken at the level of the family, there's a deep truth to that. And I think there's deep contemporary issues that we can get a lens into through my personal story and through others' personal stories about the way in which the family is struggling today. At the same time, if I could bring my father into the room, and he's passed away, but if my father were to come into the room and he was to tell us about his childhood, well, we get another story of trauma. And it, arguably, we could compare our traumas. Maybe his would outweigh mine. Who knows? And then if his father would come into the room and tell us about his childhood, and so on and so forth, all the way back to the earliest families. that there were, so my point is that, probably this is, I think, what the Christian story is getting at with the fall, in some sense, that we're fallen, and so that there's something of a fall that in some sense unifies us all in some sort of primordial trauma, and Christians will call that maybe original sin. And problems around that, and the mythological stories around that, and about the law and transgression and biting the fruit and all of the mess of history and pain and suffering and sacrifice that human beings have endured for millennia. But at the same time, I do think that there is a present day trauma and a present day raw. And I think that a lot of that does have to do with a pointing towards deconstruction. I think a lot of that does have to do with a genuine difference with the way in which we relate to masculinity symbolically, energetically, idealistically. That I don't think we can avoid the fact that there is a genuine historical difference with the relationship between the sexes, which does seem odd historically, evolutionarily. A lot of it, I think, is technological. Like in my thesis work and in what I was referencing before, with sort of trying to come up with the idea of the decline of a certain system and potentially the emergence of a different system. A lot of it seems to have to do with the insane difference of technology and the insane difference in living standards. And what's really interesting, and I'll stop by giving a story about something that pained me recently. Something about there's been an insane advance, so to speak, in material conditions mediated by technology. But there's something that pains us at the core, which does not seem to be resolved in any way by our material conditions. And the story I'll tell just very quickly is that my partner and I watched a movie that she really liked as a kid called The Virgin Suicides. It was directed by Sofia Coppola, I believe. It's a great movie. And I won't go into the details of the story, but it does involve basically four girls committing suicide. And in the context of a prohibition against having premarital sex in a very Christian, strict family context. So there is relationships here to the fall. But what made me really sad, it was a great movie, but it made me really sad. And the reason why it made me really sad is because whenever I see a family environment, an archetypal family environment in a North American context, where they have material abundance, but there's just this horrible pain, social pain at the core of the family. Like there's not love between the husband and wife. There's this weird tension between the parents and the children. And like there's just this general unease in the house. Even though they like the parents have good jobs, they're not wanting for food, they're not wanting for security, and so forth. There's just this uneasiness, there's this pain there, and it just makes me incredibly sad. And I think it's because I'm just like, damn, no matter what job you get, no matter how much, no matter what your income is, no matter how stable you are in material terms, there's just something about the human condition that's really messed up. And of course I relate to it with the father figure. Like I'm kind of feeling sad projecting myself onto the father figure and being like, oh, being a father is such a paradox, and how the hell could I embody that? And it just seems like a trap and all this stuff. And then my partner's like, yeah, but what about the mom? And of course she's projecting her identity onto the mom, and it's like, well, yeah, you can see that way as well. And so yeah, that's just sort of, where I am with thinking through these things. And again, coming back to, yeah, I mean, the cross does seem like a really important symbol here.
Yeah, I think it's very special in this moment to be holding I can feel like so many dynamic big picture cultural layers revealing themselves at the same time as like continuing to draw it down into that root, which is the family, which is the home, and that vivid sense of the alienated American middle class family life. And yeah, the bigger the house, the more dysfunctional the family seems to be part of the situation. And there's a couple of things that come for me here is first, well, first appreciating the tenderness of that recounting. Second, there's a sense that something of the tightening of belts involved in most of history, the hardness of circumstances potentially had an effect of binding people together and binding together the family, even in the midst of the fallenness, even in the midst of dysfunction, even in the midst of trauma. Something about the encounter with necessity that made up most people's lives kind of bound those relationships more closely together, um, between husband and wife and between children and parents. And I definitely get a sense that that's the case here in Mexico, where there's a lot more deprivation and the country is a lot less wealthy, but families are much more bound together. Most young people are living with their parents until they're like 26 or 27. Um, I left home at 18 to go to university. So it's a very different situation. It's like there's a whole PhD postdoc period of family life that they have here that, ends for most of us. Um, then historically speaking, we have the combination of the very, very recent fall of the First World War and Second World War, which seem to demonstrate there's something wrong with the model. Um, at least slowly, the integration of that definitely seems to have informed the sense of like something was wrong with the way we were doing masculinity. And then simultaneous to that, and as a consequence of total war, you get women in the workplace for the first time, which people tried to undo afterwards, but wasn't really like cat was out of the bag. And so now this distinct sense of belonging in roles and identities as I am the man who goes to work and provides, and you are the woman who works the home and provides. And there's this balancing of different spheres which are distinct and meet, but have this distinctness that's like self-evident and known, and also like enacted socially, like men go and drink with men and women possibly drink with women, or don't drink but spend time with women. So the revolution in the workplace changes that. And then within a few decades, the technological revolution, not just basically like liberating women from domestic work, washing machines, different kinds of technologies that radically reduce the labor burden of women and girls. You get computers and you get this like weird leveling out of the landscape of work into like there's like this flat landing neutralizing of everything where difference seems to also disappear in work as well. And so there's like less and less and less context of the differentiation and the polarity, I suppose, as well. And that the lack of war and conflict also feeds into this potentially. And then the debasement, the deracination, the hollowing out of Christianity, which also probably bore out, um, to a significant degree, a story of a structure of relationship of man, woman, and child, which was contextualized there. that's also rooted out. And now the divorce rate is through the roof. It seems to be real problems with the nuclear family. And along with all of that, we have polyamory as a kind of like maybe we need to like radically change things. And some people view that as a new innovation, others view it as a return to the old, but that's also part of the pretty loco situation that we find ourselves in. Um, the last piece I wanted to touch on was just the sense of displacement that I feel when you say like deconstruction of masculinity. I feel it less and less now because I feel more substantially rooted in it. And I also feel that in connection with you and being with you, like I feel like there's a sense in which you feel yourself as a man in relationship to other men. Masculinity is known by masculinity. And we find that more and more, and then it becomes more substantial through the encounter. But prior to that, yeah, I feel that it's like there's a there's a hollowing out of what it means, and there's no effort to give substance to what it is to be a man. And that creates a position of displacement or insecurity. Um, and it does seem like a lot of women are being brought to the position of taking over the masculine parts of relationship, or at least trying to assume them to an equal or greater degree than their male counterparts. I don't know if that's just my imagination, but I've seen a lot of couples recently where the woman is like more physically dense and strong than the male counterpart. And it's kind of speaks to that, like it's a physical manifestation of that reversal of roles potentially taking place, um, even an inversion. So,
Yeah.
like, I'm trying to sense into the question in this moment, but the question is still elusive to me. I'm still just in the confoundment of like,
Mm.
where am I? What's going on? And then like can try and come back to what's the feeling, what's the compass of sex, God, and masculinity? What's the compass that comes from that trifecta that actually gives me clarity amidst all of this?
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, let's maybe start there and also feel into the confusion, and genuinely feel into the confusion and not feel like we need to come up with an answer to that. In some sense, some of the most, critique that we had from the Sex Masculinity God book is like, you're not telling me what religion I should join. You're not telling me what to think about God. You guys are just talking about sex, masculinity, and God, and it's like it's interesting, but I don't know what the hell you guys are in the end really trying to tell me. I was like, well, that was kind of the vibe. That was kind of the vibe. It's like like we weren't trying to come to like a big consensus between the three of us or something like that. We were just like looking for a space to be in the confusion a little bit, and also recognizing that it's okay not to have answers and it's okay to feel disoriented, because I think the only honest position to take, at least from my point of view today, is to feel a little bit disoriented. And one of my favorite theorists, Alenka Zupancic, in her book What is Sex, she comes up with a metaphysics which I quite like, which is called object disoriented ontology. And that's just a fancy way of saying that when you really go to the core of sex masculinity and God, or sex femininity and God, it's I think what you do tarry with there is a little bit of a disorientation. And you know I've been thinking a lot lately as well myself about the way religion and specifically human social necessities and bonds between family members seems to be tightly coupled to material necessity. That I was reflecting recently, just a few days ago, about the imagery in the Louvre, in the pre-modern images there of the human condition, specifically some of the Renaissance paintings from France and Italy. And I think that what you see in those images is that you sort of see sort of the religious narratives and the religious myths are really about the negativities of the human condition, um, the difficulties of the human drama, war, childbirth and child rearing, death ever present, always around the corner. And I think that in our European context, that I mean, and the whole world by extension, before the modern world, death was always very close. And in some sense, modernity is, we shouldn't remember, modernity is, it is a curse in some sense, but it is also a gift. And one of the gifts of modernity, it has been this giving us a distance from some of the brutal realities that submerged all humans throughout civilizational history, giving us some gap from that. Now, the consequence of that has been probably due to a lack of self and collective reflection on what religion was doing and where families come from and where social structures come from fundamentally. We've had a progressive isolation. We've had a progressive individuation. And I think that a lot of the disorientation, a lot of the confusion is about how do I mediate a return to human social necessities when I've become sort of an isolated individual? And how do I come to terms with the way in which returning to basic human social necessities will change basic ways in which basic presuppositions about gender, basic presuppositions about sex, a lot of those will come to the surface. Now, what's coming to my mind when you were talking about women in the workplace and, things like things that seem simple, like the introduction of the washing machine. There's that, I don't know if you know it, but there's this famous Simpsons episode with Hank Scorpio and Globotech. You remember the Hank Scorpio and Globotech
I
episode?
remember him. Yeah.
In that episode, Homer gets a job at a global technological company. You kind of don't know what the company's doing. Like, that's kind of
Yeah.
the joke, is like there's
Yeah.
just this global international company. You have no idea what it's doing. And you don't even really know what Homer's doing, but he's getting a lot of money. And Hank Scorpio is really powerful. And one of the things that happens in that episode is that one of the storylines in that is that Marge doesn't know what to do at home
Yeah.
because they have this
Yeah.
automated washing machine and they have the automated dishes, and the lawn waters itself and mows itself. So Marge is like, "What do I do? What do I?" That's one of her tensions in the episode.
And then she
But
starts
just
drinking wine
yeah, she starts
to
drinking
deal with
wine.
the anxiety of the
Absolutely.
situation.
She's just bored drinking wine in the middle of the day because there's nothing to do. There's no house to clean it, and it's just, and that's just a little bit of a I think a way in which Simpsons sort of nailed sort of a cultural analysis there in that. But, at the same time, I don't think that the solution to our current situation is to discourage or to try to go back to a world in which all women are just in the house and all women are housewives. I do think the challenge here is a sublation. The challenge here is to take the gifts that modernity has given us and to affirm the genuine progress that humans have made in a new technological environment. And at the same time, reconfront some really difficult issues about sex and gender, and maybe reconcile with some things about sex and gender which actually are the same, and haven't changed, even though our environment is different. Right? Our environment is different, but what's the same? And my thesis is what's the same, and I'm still working on this, but let me try and work it out with you here and see if I can do a good job explaining it.
Please.
Is that what the fundamental, in my view, the fundamental problem in progressivist emancipatory politics since, let's say, the end of World War II has been the unquestioned presupposition of sex positivity. So that's the thesis I'm going to work with. Since World War II, the problem with progressivist emancipatory politics, often called leftist politics, is an unquestioned presupposition of sex positivity. Now, this first comes out of the countercultural revolution, and this comes as an explosion of sex positivity in relationship to what's perceived as a repressive, regulatory Christian traditionalist culture.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what the legacy of the countercultural revolution and the core of the countercultural revolution has a lot that I think we need to preserve and a lot that's great. But the question is sex fundamentally this positive, life-affirming, vitalistic dimension of reality? Or was there a deeper truth in the structures that they were resisting, the fundamentally based on Christian, Judeo-Christian values, let's say, of something that, from my readings, looks a lot like original sin, which would be much more pointing towards something like sex negativity. That actually sex is something fundamental. Now, I'm saying that in an ontological sense. Sex is something fundamentally negative. That doesn't say, therefore, what our ethical stance in relationship to sex is. So I'm not saying, okay, because sex is negative, therefore it's bad to do polyamory. I'm not saying sex is negative, therefore you should be abstinent, or you should save sex before marriage, or that you should just become a monk. And, I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying is that if there's a fundamental negativity at the core of sexuality, then the consequence of how we think through how to regulate relationships on the level of libidinal interaction will be different. The conversations will be a lot more serious. There'll be a lot more naive. There'll be a lot less naivete, and there'll be a lot more red flags about an unquestioned expression of immediate sexual pleasure. Definitely. Right. And in some
this
sense,
is fascinating. I want to pause quickly for some translation, because I know probably some of my listeners don't understand positivity and negativity in like the philosophical context in which you use those terms. So if it's possible, can you like put those in other words, or like give another meaning, because they have
Sure.
other associations.
So
you're not saying one is good and bad. That's
not
what's indicated here.
No, I mean that's a different that's maybe a different level. That's maybe on a theological level, and we can talk about that, and we can talk about good and evil as well. And this does have consequences for good and evil. But before I started talking, you were talking about feeling a sense of displacement from a deconstructed masculinity in regards to substance. A feeling of feeling substantially unrooted versus being substantially rooted. When I say sex negativity and sex positivity, in some sense, what I'm saying is is there a positive substance or a positive essence at the core of sexuality which we can express in abundance, limitless? Like a lot of the people at the countercultural revolution were treating sex and working with sex as if it was some infinite substance which could be shared without boundaries, and we could, and that the reason why we had all these taboos around sex was just because of sort of Christian normative framework. But if that we got rid of the Christian normative framework, we would have a sex positive expression,
which is
right?
free love. Love,
Free
like love
free
being
love.
an abundant and sex being more or less the same thing. It's something that is abundant in reality and should be shared,
Absolutely.
as much as reasonably possible.
Right. So that's what I'm calling sex positivity, and the movements that, and then there are consequences for how we conceive of our gender and interact with other beings as a result of that ontological presupposition. But in contrast to that, if sex, what I mean sex negativity is, what if that sex is actually some fundamental lack? What if there's some fundamental something missing actually at the core of our being? And one of the strongest arguments for that is that fundamentally, when you engage in sex, you're engaging not with two phalluses, but a phallus and a hole. And out of that hole comes a new being. But there's fundamentally a nothingness that you're contending with there. That there's, and the anxiety and the negativity that we can experience, for example, in a breakup, or when we're rejected, or when we feel like we're not at our highest potency, is actually primary. Like that's sort of the fundamental reality we're dealing with, and that there's some fundamental negativity in which we're engaging with there that you can cover over with substance, but that what you're covering over is the deeper layer of something missing there. There's something not, there's something non, again, I don't want to use too much philosophical jargon, but that there's something incomplete there at the core of sexuality. Now, from that, I think that there's huge consequences for politics, is basically what I'm saying. And huge consequences for politics when it comes to thinking through relationships. Let's just say, in the most general sense, libidinal relationships in a new technological environment, and libidinal relationships in a new technological environment that need to think through long-term social mediation, families, communities. To me, I don't care. To me personally, I don't care too much if we're talking about men, women, 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 different genders. To me, the distinction that I bring to the forefront and that I want to put as the main focus is the difference between short-term sexual immediacy and long-term sexual mediation. So when I say sex, masculinity, and God, what I'm doing there is I'm taking the immediacy of sex and I'm focusing on the long-term mediation of that energy. I don't care if it's with a man, or polyamory, monogamy. I'm not even making that distinction. If you can have a relationship with 3 people and it's a long-term structure where everyone sort of is on board with it, and it's and can manage the negativity of those relationships, and everyone sort of feels like this is the structure which is right for me. If that's the truth, great. I don't care, right? That's great. I'm happy for you. From my experience in poly, the negativity is very high. And the only way in which I see poly being done is in a short term or in a deceptive way, right? Where it's not like, deep bonds of trust being formed, and stable identities that are sort of secure in their own essence, so to speak. Now, before I close here, I just want to make a final point about desubstantialized masculinity versus substantialized masculinity, and what does that mean? To me, I want to bring it back to the cross, because again, I bring it back to where I came across in my journey, is that the cross is is potentially fundamental and a really important symbol to tarry with, and perhaps especially important to tarry with for masculinity. The idea that I come across is that maybe what that symbol means is that true masculinity has to go close to death, and that true masculinity has to go through death in order to be truer, in order to give immortal life, let's say. What that means actually is that I think masculinity has to desubstantialize itself. That actually masculinity has to, that when masculinity is too much focused on itself as a positive substance, of course, I'm going to try and here to use that metaphor as just like an ejaculatory metaphor. So, like when masculinity is too much just a positive substance, it gets too carried away with its own fantasies. It gets too carried away with its own sort of immediate joy. That in order for masculinity to be matured, actually, I think it does need to be deconstructed. And I think the cross, but like then the question is, how is it deconstructed? And maybe the cross is a good symbol for that deconstruction. And maybe that needs to happen for masculinity, because for femininity, they're naturally closer to death through birth, because they actually give birth and they actually go through a type of identity death through giving birth. Now, if they're not giving birth, then they're not close to that. And so then that's another issue, right? But the thesis would be that femininity has a natural path to death through birth, because they actually are giving birth.
And menstruation.
And that for masculinity, there needs to be, it seems to me, a more culturally, spiritually mediated process, which can happen or it cannot happen. Right? Like, so like there you get the phenomenon of, now here's like kind of the cool thing about being a man and the shitty thing about being a man at the same time, from my point of view, is that it seems like men can delay this indefinitely. Like, so you have the phenomenon of men never growing up, right? Like they can just, I'm gonna stay, and like, and there are some films and there are some good movies and stuff that make fun of guys like this, where it does seem kind of like, it's like the guy who's like 35 or 40, but he's still trying to get a chick who's 20 or something like that. Like he just won't grow up. Like he just, he won't pretend, he just pretends he can be a 20-year-old forever. Right? Or something like that. And perhaps that's what our culture is and then to close, perhaps that's what our culture is reconciling itself with on a deep level, on the libidinal level, is that men in the West perhaps are wrestling with Christianity. And here, like, for example, as a sort of proof of this as a cultural phenomenon, Jordan Peterson is writing a book called Wrestling with God. And for many people, for many young men in our culture, like him or not, Jordan Peterson is and was a type of paternal figure for a lot of men. And he's writing a book called Wrestling with God. And so maybe that means that men in the West today are wrestling with God. And they're wrestling with God because they're trying to find some way to die, but not in a sort of postmodern deconstructive lens, but through the image of the cross, through the meaning of the cross. And maybe that is sort of a ground from which a new culture could be born. But whatever culture is born from that, I would argue that we have to really wrestle with the contradictions of modernity and not simply go back to we're not in the 1st century anymore. We're not in the 3rd century. I don't think we should go back to like just a medieval or an ancient world notion of Christianity. I think whatever needs to come out needs to be, I think, what you call a Christianity beyond itself, which to me is a Christianity which is reinventing itself for the 21st century. And now I'm really going to stop. But what I've really liked is what would a Christianity in the 3rd millennium look like? What does Christianity need to look like in its 3rd millennium? And I think that's like a genuinely like crucial theological question, because if you think about Christianity, it's entering its third millennium technically, and in its first millennium, it did go through a big transition, right? Like there were breaks, and of course, in the middle of the millennium, it went through an even bigger break with the Protestant Reformation and stuff like that. So maybe asking here, maybe we've got to ask, what is Christianity in the third millennium?
Let that mic drop, slow motion.
Yeah, this is my attempt for a B Rabbit moment. You know, I'm
That
just
was
trying to
fire. That was fire. Yeah, that's the most important question I'm encountering right now. So I'm glad to hear it coming through you in this moment. And it's around the axis of that question that we can like locate a lot of these other questions in a very creative and substantial fashion. Yeah, that to me is the greatest project available in this lifetime, probably. So, yeah, I really like what you've laid out here, Cadell. When I hear like negativity in the sense that like sex, the interaction of sex, what we're fundamentally coming into relationship with through sex is negativity. I'm hearing like void, like we're coming in relationship to the void, like the emptiness, some like a place where self dies. Um, is that kind of, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that we don't have two positive principles. We have a positive principle and a negative principle, and that the positive principle is going into a negative principle,
Mm-hmm.
and from that negative principle, the self dies and is reborn.
Aha.
And like and
Not, yes. Yeah, yeah.
that's also literally true if we think about sex in its biological function.
Which,
I don't think we can
yeah.
reduce sex to its biological function, but that is sort of how it works on a biological level.
The I work from the understanding at this point that the physical is a metaphorical reflection of the metaphysical in some meaningful sense. Like uh somebody Bethany Tabor said to me that the erect phallus is the physical symbolic reflection of the will, and the womb, or the vagina, the womb, is metaphysics. And so I play with things like that, and I definitely feel that's true. But there's a caveat, because in the context of post-sexual revolution culture, the yeah, I think what I'm starting to glean is that the positivity of sex, like, has lost the negativity of sex, because at a more superficial level, or the more sociological level, there was a rejection of the shaming of sex, the shaming of women, the control of women, the socially instantiated control of sex as a form of relationality prior to that revolution. But somehow they lost the negativity, meaning the void nature of what's actually going on there. And so out of that, then you get like the extreme expression of the sex positivity, which is pornography culture. And pornography culture actually actively debases, or it like so elevates the material and the positive in such a way that it completely obfuscates and hides, and it causes us to lose connection with the negativity, which is the depth of what's going on there. And so actually it's possible for a man to engage in sex without experiencing the death because he's engaging with it with that uh pornographic mind kind of positivity in which he's still in a subject object relation, and there's not that place in which he's actually lose like the intense power of the negativity of sex to actually lose one's selfhood in the presence of another, and what's the consequence of that for how it causes us to relate to one another. So this is really deep and interesting, and I love including death as the core of this, and the notion that for men we need to die. A big part of the rot seems to be that we have lost initiation, and initiation is something which occurs through ritual, something we've also lost, and something which also occurs over time, not just in the context of the ritual, but through relationship, through having men with whom you have initiatory relationships. And I think, I don't know about you, Cadell, but I definitely lacked both of those. And that was part of my experience of navigating this displacement. Um, Nonetheless, I can track myself as experiencing at least three major deaths in the course of my adult life, all of which kind of track with this model that you're putting forward. And it's something like reaching the utmost limits of the self that you've got, or indeed the form of masculinity you've got, and having that broken. And I think what can happen is actually that the masculine can break open into the feminine, and that the feminine can be broken open into the masculine. And that's kind of how I track the arc of my journey, was like I had a certain kind of limited masculinity as a younger man in my early 20s, and it was more of that form of masculinity that can't actually experience the death. Um, and then that eventually broke open, and the breaking open of that was a breaking open to the feminine. And I was able to deeply, deeply discover a great deal in that. And then at a certain point, that more feminine expression of myself came into confrontation with life in a way that broke it open into another masculine emergence, which now is sort of where I find myself, is sort of a new balance, a new balance between the masculine and feminine, and trying to occupy that and trying to understand that and trying to hold that. And it's really fascinating to me that this extends into our relationship with the divine and with plant medicine. And that's probably where I want to take it now, because I've been thinking a great deal. And in just the last week, I had a really powerful experience of with cannabis, which had me experientially contemplating a great deal the goddess, or the feminine nature of the divine, and thinking how this may, in fact, be an enormous piece of the puzzle for a Christianity beyond itself. And in short, because I want to hand it back to you, I'm seeing that we have a historical arc of a patriarch God, and then we have a rejection of that patriarch God. And we don't then have a feminine nature of God being discovered. We have a tyrannical kind of um, toxic maternal instinct at an atheist sociological level in culture, but we don't have we haven't shifted from the male aspect of God into integrating the female aspect. We've just kind of killed the male aspect of God and are now in the wake of that. And it seems like what is necessary in the climate crisis is actually to come into relationship with the feminine nature of divinity, and to start to bring the feminine nature of God and the masculine nature of God into some deeper relationality.
Yeah, this is a tough one. This is a tough one, and it seems like how we confront this. Seems like how we confront this. I feel like there's a lot of stakes precisely at this level. How do we confront this? I know at Philosophy Portal, we've come down to, or I mean, it's not like there's been a poll or like a consensus, but like something that has like come up in the discourse as something that seems to be generally affirmed is the notion of the spirit child. And this actually comes out of Nietzsche's spiritual metamorphoses, but they're sort of properties of the spirit child that seem a lot like sort of an important foundation for the birth of a new culture, a life-giving culture, and a general sort of disposition of mind and spirit, which has an emptiness and a vitality to it, and a sort of a joy and a wonder to it of seeing the world for the first time, seeing the world as if for the first time. Now I'm going to try and, in a way, get to this spirit child through what you're trying to work through, the masculine and the feminine, and see if it lands in any way. So you were talking a lot about sex positivity, and the paradox of sex positivity when it loses the negativity is that, in some sense, what we get is the pornographic mind, which is in some sense a completely leading to a sterile culture, right? It's not a culture that can give birth, right? It's a culture of immediacy. It's not a culture that can give birth. Now, the paradox there with the sex negativity is that it's actually that you need to go into the negativity in order to produce a new positivity. You need to be able to go into the void. So, in regards to Bethany Tabor's metaphors, the erect phallus and the symbolic will needs to be able to go into the womb, needs to be able to become metaphysical in order to birth a new culture. If we're gonna use that, in order to use that language. Now, for me, the womb is also the void, but it's the space of the pluripotential void. It's much more the way in which people think about the void in contemporary quantum physics, and that's just a metaphor. It's just physical, what you're talking about of the physical and the metaphysical. It's just a metaphor. But the idea that the void is where the potential is. In quantum physics, the void is full of virtual particles that pop in and out of existence and annihilate each other just as quickly. Which is kind of what's happening like when you just watch pornography. It's just like virtual particles emerging and colliding and annihilating each other as quickly as they arise. Right? Like this video, that video, this video, that video, boom, I'm gone. Right? Like it's kind of like that. But the void is where the potential is at the same time. Now, the womb is also where the birth of the child comes. And I think the spirit child being sort of the metaphysical dimension that at least Philosophy Portal sort of has focused on, has an importance there. Now, the question is there an imbalance in Christianity that needs to be rectified? Or and this came up in the sex, masculinity, God discussions, what I've noticed is that people on the more new age side of things think that we need to balance the masculine with the feminine, and that Christianity is missing the feminine. I would actually say that Christianity maybe got it right, that that the feminine should be represented as a negativity, that they're not two balanced principles of the masculine and the feminine.
Mm-hmm.
So there's God the Father, there's the Son, and then there's the Holy Ghost in Christianity. And the question is this correct way to represent things? So if that is the correct way to represent things, this is how I would read it, is that God the Father is kind of like the substance. God the Father, say, the substance of the world. God the Father, the substance, releases itself into the world as a subject, Jesus, who has to die, and then be reborn as the Holy Spirit, to be reborn as the community of believers. But in that process, the weird thing is that Jesus as the cross, Jesus as the symbol of death and resurrection to found the new community, is kind of like the masculine going into the feminine, the masculine going into death, the masculine going into the metaphysical void, as opposed to jerking off in it as a positive substance, and then builds the community out of that. That actually, again, it's sort of like a pagan principle to think that we're dealing with two balanced entities. That the Christian insight is actually we're dealing with a fundamental imbalance. And then what's the problem in our culture? The problem in our culture is that the men of our generation have yet to die. Like that's what we have. Like that's what we have to do. We have to die better. Like we have to die better in order to give birth to the next generation. And that if we don't do that, then the new culture won't come. Like the new culture, like that's sort of like where I'm coming at with the culture war thing, is like the culture war won't be solved on a podcast platform. The culture war won't be solved through a rational debate, a dialogos. It won't be solved through a dialogos, I don't think. The culture war has to be resolved by the men who are aware of the culture war dying and giving birth. Like it's like, so for me, like, let me just bring it back to me personally. Like I don't have a kid. Like I've been trying to die into a monogamous partnership, and I've had to die into that. Now, I know I have anxiety about it, so I know it's true that if I have a child, my whole life is going to be changed. Like everything's going to be changed if I have a child. My partner's going to change. I'm going to have to change. A lot of me's going to have to die. In order to what? In order to be the father. In order to be the father. And yeah, so I think that kind of that resolves the culture war. Like in some sense, the culture war is just a fight over. We're not. It could even be just a fight over. We're not socially reproducing ourselves. We're not biosocially reproducing ourselves, and then the culture war is just a fight about that. And so, probably the truth of that battle will just, and that's the weird thing. I know I have to bring this back to philosophy. Like I'm just too tempted not to bring it back to philosophy, but that's sort of like the truth of the Hegelian dialectic. Is the truth of the Hegelian dialectic is when you have two principles in a conflict with each other, like we have in the culture war, the truth is found in the dissolution of both, and the third thing being something totally different from those two principles. So, I think, like, again, it's not going to be like an irrational mediation. It's not going to be a dialogos or a rational mediation between, two people on a podcast or something, or even a larger space. It's just going to be the men who are aware of this growing up and dying into the void and taking responsibility for the next generation. That's what I don't know if I'm right, but that's what I think. That's sort of, and also that's kind of personally where I'm trying to, like, it's not like I'm happy about this. It's kind of like I'm preparing myself for that. Like I know I've got to prepare myself for that. And what type of man do I need to be to really confront that? And I'm like, well, I think there's a lot of parts of me that's gonna have to die, and that's why like the main slogan I've had since leaving the university is just die again, die better.
Wow. That's quite the slogan. That analysis of the culture war, like there's like no I almost can't place it at any of the like at the upper levels of my rational stacking, but it sinks all the way down to the bottom. And at a very, very deep level, it makes sense to me. And I include like dying on the mat of a plant medicine journey as a significant piece of what may be inducing that as well. And that I think when when you find yourself in an absolutely inescapable bind at the level of culture war, or indeed at the level of war within yourself, there can be a way in which the only way to break through that bind is by dying, and by kind of like breaking open the underlying container that is giving rise to the the entangled polarity, and then out of that, perhaps new forms of polarities can emerge, but you don't solve the problem by being inside of the problem space. And we all, this is like kind of dawning in the cultural consciousness. Everybody's quoting Einstein. You can't solve problems with the ways of thinking that created them. But the necessary courage and the depth of the death that is involved in actually enacting that, I think that's something that is a much slower, deeper growing kernel, seed in the cultural consciousness. And perhaps that is ultimately the root of this Christianity beyond itself that
Because it's,
is
can I
coming
just say quick?
forward.
Because it's not about the consciousness, it's about the unconscious. Consciousness can't deal with it.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Like, consciousness isn't going to be able to solve it. Consciousness is terrified about this. It's about the unconscious.
Right. We have to get out of the swimming pool and into the ocean kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that, yeah, I mean, there's, yeah, whatever, yeah, whatever metaphor, yeah. But so, like, in regards to the dying on the mat with the plant medicine, like, my view on, like, and I support the psychedelics and stuff like that. I worked at a psychedelic company, done research and so forth. My perspective on it is like, once you've gotten the message, so to speak, from an experience like that, then the real challenge is, okay, like, you've got to live it out now.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that the trap of the psychedelic community is turning the psychedelic thing into an identity which you repeat. Now, I'm not saying that you can't embed psychedelics within some ritual container, which is sort of like ongoing, maybe throughout your life. Everyone's going to have their personal relationship to that. It's very personal, just like religion is incredibly personal, because of course it brings us to the religious questions. But for me personally, it's like, got the download. I might, the download, got the message, and now, like, it's really about embodying it and living it out.
I thoroughly concur. Yeah. And I actually don't think, at least from solely my own experience, that's not a trap. Um, it's more like if you continue to run the experiment again and again and again, eventually, it breaks out into something theological. And you start, like, if you keep exploring psychedelics long enough, and there was like probably 4 or 5 years where it was like, oh, that's, where the mystery is for me. And I just keep like, returning to that space and exploring it. Uh, Eventually the mystery breaks beyond the context of the psychedelic experience into day-to-day life, and naturally it becomes the work of the walk and things like prayer and the building of the living community comes forth. Um, wow. I feel really good about this conversation, Cadell. I feel like we've established a very potent foundation for a future conversation. The question of my own contending with this kind of poly monogamy landscape is awaits further wrestling. But it feels proper for me to park that because we've circled around something so um substantial that I want to like give it space to land in people's psyche and see what conversations are provoked by this conversation for the people who listen to it and also in me in the coming days. Yeah, very, very thankful to have gotten here and thankful to you and also anything else that you so wish to include at this point is welcome as well. But yeah, really honored to be wrestling with Christianity with you.
Yeah, no, this has been a great conversation, and you're a fantastic person to discuss with, and you opened up a really interesting space. And I find myself really trying to reconnect with whatever that discussion thread was that I tried to open up in Sex, Masculinity, God. I think I need to, open it up again and continue to work through that thread. Um, but for anyone who's still with us listening to this conversation, if you're interested to find out more about my work or what I'm up to, you just probably go to philosophyportal.online and probably everything will be there. Um, and I guess I can leave it there and just thank you for this conversation.
No, thank you so much, Cadell. And yeah, anybody wants to be wrestling philosophically on a regular basis with interesting people, check out Philosophy Portal. All right.